Hello.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can. How are you?
I am good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank
So,
you.
as people are trickling in, I'm just going to start by giving you a little bit of background information as to what this book club is so that you know kind of a little bit about who is reading along and who might be joining. So, this is a book club that I started 2 years ago now. I was wrapping up, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and I was wrapping up my internship year in which I was working predominantly with marginalized and underserved populations and was feeling very much kind of just like frustrated by the barriers to accessing mental health treatment and how long waiting lists are and how expensive therapy is. And so had made this Instagram account to make a blanket offer to help anyone navigate finding a therapist. And got a ton of messages from people all over the country, as well as Canada and the UK and kind of some random places. But a lot of people would say to me, either I don't have the resources or the time or don't feel ready to be seeking therapy, but can you give me some recommendations for books?
Mm.
And so that's where this started. So every month we read a different book related to something with mental health. So it could be trauma, it could be relationships, it could be boundaries. It's quite a range, and then have the wonderful privilege of speaking to the authors. And so some people tune in live, other people watch replays, some people just read and send in questions. So it's quite a mix, but we are so honored to have you as this month's book. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for picking Break the Cycle for this month's book club pick. It's just an honor to be able to be selected and to be in conversation with you. As fellow clinicians, I'm excited to dive into things with you, so I can't wait.
I'm very excited. So everyone knows who you are, but obviously tonight we are so honored to be speaking with Dr. Buqué, who's a psychologist and an intergenerational trauma expert and the author of this wonderful, wonderful book, Break the Cycle. And I have to say that your book is so powerful and really is so breathtaking. You write in a way that really makes each reader feel like you're speaking directly to them, which is such a gift. And I was also, just on a personal level, so impressed by how clearly you discuss the way that trauma affects epigenetics. A large part of my PhD research was about epigenetics, and I found that despite doing years of research about it, I could never clearly explain it to people who didn't know what epigenetics were. And so I was amazed by how clearly and accessibly you explain things. So it was really a joy to read.
Oh, that's so good to hear. That's really great feedback because my hope was to make all of the language of the book, but in particular the scientific language, language that somebody like my parents could read and understand.
Yes.
And that I wouldn't make it so ivory tower and inaccessible that people that need the healing wouldn't be able to access the language or get what I'm really talking about. So that's really wonderful feedback. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you do it so well. So I have a list of questions that I wrote as I was reading and people wrote in, but if anyone has questions along the way, I'm going to welcome them just to put it in the chat. I'm curious, as you were writing the book, were there any ways that writing the book specifically helped you with your own intergenerational trauma? That there was work that you had been doing obviously before writing the book, but any ways that writing the book surprised you in your own healing?
Absolutely. The writing of the book made me realize, in particular, the chapter that's called When Collective Trauma Enters Your Home is the only chapter that I completely scrapped and rewrote. And I felt such immense pressure to get that chapter right. Here comes my, perfectionistic
Yes.
standards, my deciding to do it all myself, hyper independence, like a lot of the wounds that still had remnants left within me, were definitely surfacing, but there was also this almost kind of a resurfacing of even my own collective trauma wounds and wanting to be as representative, as inclusive, as, inviting to every kind of experience that we have out there could be fall under the category of collective trauma, and I felt such immense pressure to get it right. So my own wounds were, interestingly enough, resurfacing in reference to that chapter in particular. And I had to do some real like wound care, some tender moments needed to be put in place in order to help me through those moments. And yeah, it was very, very shocking, to be honest. I wasn't expecting that, especially with that chapter. I really wasn't.
And to you, I'm curious, what did getting that chapter right, what did that even mean to you?
Well, I felt like I just had to go into my mind a lot to make sure that I was being, the inclusivity piece really mattered to me. And I wanted to make sure that every set of identities that is held at the margins, that is likely an identity that for any one human being can be something that creates a profound sense of a traumatic experience because that person is a part of a collective that is targeted. That was a part that I really wanted to make sure like people felt seen, they felt heard, that they understood that I was doing my best to be inclusive of their experiences. And because we are living in a world of billions of people with so many different vast experiences, it was, to be honest, like I would say unrealistic
Yeah.
to actually, yeah, to create one chapter of a book that could actually hit at every single experience. So I really needed to offer the grace to myself that I would have added to,
Yeah.
my with someone else.
Yeah. Um, I think just off the bat, there were a couple questions that people wrote in generally about kind of definitions and questions about therapy and intergenerational trauma that I want to kind of, before we dive deep into the book, I want to touch on these off the bat. A couple of people wrote in and asked what the difference is between complex PTSD and intergenerational trauma, if there is a difference, and I'm curious your perspective.
Yes, it's such a good question. I really love that somebody proposed it. So, complex PTSD is the type of trauma that derives typically from childhood, but it can even be a trauma that derives from having had multiple points of injury, emotional injury in one's life and adversity. We tend to see it more so happen as childhood adversity. So typically those kinds of adversities that may fall within the, adverse childhood experiences or an extended version of that. And what we know about complex trauma is that in part it also tends to feel like personality when people don't really know that it's a trauma response. So we have that all of that happening from childhood into adulthood. Intergenerational trauma adds a layer of complexity because it's also a biological transmission of trauma, meaning that a person's biology and psychology, they have to basically meet at an intersection to make it intergenerational, which means that we could have had a parent that themselves were in complex trauma, and as a result of them being in that long-standing traumatized state, their genetic encoding could have, in essence, reflected, oh, we are in a traumatized mind, body, we are in stress. We've organized our personality subconsciously to actually be a personality that is organized around stress because it has been so much of the norm. And so all of that is, a part of those genetic mechanisms that then when our parents conceive us, those genetic messaging or messages get transferred over. And if we develop trauma symptoms or complex trauma symptoms within our own lifetime, our generation, then we have two generations of complex trauma or two generations of trauma proper, which makes it intergenerational. Complex being one generation, intergenerational meaning there have been two generations or more, and that there is a biological thread.
That's a very good and clear distinction between the two of them. Um, a couple other people wrote in about like therapy modalities for trauma, and so I tried to condense the questions into one. People were wondering whether common therapy modalities for trauma, such as whether it be prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, do those apply to intergenerational trauma, or how does therapy for intergenerational trauma look different or similar from therapy for PTSD or any kind of trauma?
Hmm. You know, there we lean on efficacy and evidence base when it comes to any kind of mental health care, right?
Yeah.
But the thing about these things is that when I started, like for example, I'm trained in prolonged exposure. I'm trained in multiple trauma modalities. One of my favorite being dialectical behavioral therapy, even
Yeah.
though it wasn't explicitly stated as being, although now they
Agree.
complex
Yeah.
trauma. Before it was for borderline personality disorder, when we
Yeah.
were kind of, it's
Yeah.
it's the history. I know you know it well. Um, but intergenerational trauma is a type of trauma that cannot be addressed just by way of helping a person to reorganize their cognition, because it is a type of trauma that is not just in the mind, it is also very body based. And there are also what I call like spiritual disruptions, which it's not necessarily like spirituality, but more so like our inability to connect to others, to feel dissociative,
Yeah.
chronically dissociative, especially our inability to connect with our world because we are so encapsulated in our threat response. And so all of that is actually continuously being triggered when it comes to intergenerational trauma. So if we want to look at sustainable healing for this type of trauma, it really has to be holistic. It has to be mind,
Yeah.
body, spirit. And it also has to be culture. It has to be that we also look into the ways in which our cultures, our societies, our policies, our practices are perpetuating trauma, are not protecting individuals who are victimized or survivors, and then just letting these cycles continue because the external forces are so powerful and they keep infiltrating trauma into our daily lives.
So I guess, and maybe this is like, getting too into it. So if someone wanted to address their intergenerational trauma and read your book, and you have so many wonderful tips for a holistic approach to starting to address it and healing and the intergenerational resiliency, what, aside from therapy, if they wanted to work with someone, what other work could they be doing to take that more holistic approach to address all the different components of intergenerational trauma?
Well, I would it's tricky to because there aren't like that many holistic
Yeah.
psychology, holistic mental health practitioners, which is such a disservice that we do
Yeah.
to the general public,
Yeah.
because it has taken such a long time for our fields to actually catch up to the fact that this is a modality that needs to be central to the trauma healing journey.
Yeah.
So what it looks like is a dearth in the amount of practitioners that can actually help. And we already have a dearth in practitioners,
Yeah.
period. Right? So imagine. When people find themselves at that crossroads of not being able to find someone who is holistic, and someone who can actually give them the care that is necessary, that can be holistic. One thing that I've heard time and again of people doing with the book is actually taking concepts or extractions from the book and bringing them into session and asking their therapist to incorporate certain aspects into treatment. Another thing that I was even doing prior to myself being able to have what felt more holistic care was I would go and seek out the bits and pieces that I needed from different practitioners. Like, for example, I know that everybody doesn't have access to this, but today I went to my naturopath. And my naturopath helps me a lot with decreasing the inflammation in my body. But there are multiple ways in which we can also learn from other practitioners, whether it's through workshops or through, local healers or anybody that's out there that can actually help us to find remedies for inflammation in the body. We can incorporate that knowledge or
Yeah.
engage in that relationship in order to bring in that body-based element. And so, and then with the more kind of like spirit-based kind of practices, those I think can be more easily incorporated in the home because one can journal to somebody who maybe has passed away but is very near and dear to them and is now an ancestor. One can, some people decide upon meditation, some people decide upon prayer. Like all of these different practices can be a part of the holistic incorporation into our daily lives that can now give us the mind, body, spirit element that we need in order for it to feel holistic.
Um, it's interesting because I think so much of our well-being has to do with the experiences we've had in the environments in which we've grown up in, and the nurturing we have or haven't gotten. And I remember last year, one of the books we read was The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. And in the discussion, I made a comment about how I feel like trauma is not something that we move on from. It's something we move on with. And I'm curious, you do such an eloquent job of talking about healing from intergenerational trauma. And I'm curious, like, do you feel like it is something that people can move on from, or do you think it's something that's part of people's identity and they learn to I'm trying to think of the words to describe it, but like to heal from it, but that it is inherently a part of who they are, no matter what healing they've done.
I really love your reframe. It's actually quite beautiful and very true. And I believe that um, when I reference healing from intergenerational trauma, my hope is that we can heal from the parts of us that need, or not need, but that centralize the trauma as a core part of our narrative. And maybe even psychologically, like, may need to just kind of sit there because some of us have that intergenerational loyalty and we need the connection to the people that perhaps may not do us too well, right? Like there's a lot of complexity, right? There's a lot of nuance. But more specifically, it's important for us to transition from the place where we are stuck in the central idea that we are victimized by trauma to transitioning into an understanding of this has existed in my family line, this has existed in my own journey through life, this has existed in my community. And together with it existing, healing has also existed. Resilience is also present. I can move on with this cycle breaking approach to my life and also honor the fact that other people may not be able to, may not want to. Other people may need to sit with their wounds a bit longer, or that, I may need to love people in my life, maybe from afar, or maybe even from up close, but while also safeguarding not only my emotions, but also my need to stick with my cycle breaking process, right? And so it's never really like with any trauma, really, and especially intergenerational trauma, that you're cutting the cord and now you're all of a sudden healed in this like silo of isolation. Now nothing can permeate your mind, body, and spirit. It's more so that we start embodying a different mentality, a different way of being, and one in which what I reflect in the book. One is intergenerational post-traumatic growth. One aspect of how we, in essence, move forward is by embodying those intergenerational post-traumatic growth factors. And those can even be put in place even when we have a world that continues to injure us. We can still continue to make meaning, continue to foster healthier relationships, continue to think about our healing as not just for us, but perhaps for our children, our children's children. And that can continue to be a process that we hold on to, despite the fact that we will never be fully healed, because it is not a human, it's just not a human thing, right? Like, we all carry wounds, and some of those are actually protective, and they help us to not go into the same circumstances again, understanding that there is adversity that can meet us on the other side. So it's going to be really important for us to just understand that when we're talking about being healed or a more healed self, we're talking about a version of ourselves that can embody that post-traumatic growth while also honoring the history that's there.
That's so beautifully said. I'm going to transition to some of the reader questions that people sent in. And again, if anyone has questions they want to add into the chat, they should feel welcome to. One person wrote in and asked whether you think that marginalized populations can experience intergenerational trauma even if their ancestors themselves didn't experience any violence or oppression associated with cultural resistance.
Wow. That's a little tricky, that question, because being held at the margins is that.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah, that's fair.
you know, perhaps your ancestors were not captured and enslaved for 3 centuries, and then, subjugated for many more decades thereafter. But if you are an individual who has been relegated to second class status, second class citizenship, to being subhuman in any way, and has had humanity in part or wholly stripped from them by way of the perceptions of others, that's a very traumatic experience collectively. And so I would actually reframe that. I think that that's incredibly traumatic, and perhaps one may not feel it because of one's own resilience or one's family resilience or generational resilience, and that's a beautiful thing to hold on to. But I don't know if I can really say that people who have been subjugated as a community, as a whole, are not experiencing generational trauma.
I guess to follow up, and I don't want to speak for the person who wrote it in, but if someone hasn't, I'm thinking out loud, I guess if someone hasn't been the subject of marginalization, well, I'm going to rewind what I'm saying. Yeah, I think perhaps sometimes people don't recognize the oppression that they're experiencing, and that sometimes, unfortunately, being part of an identity group in and of itself,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a
like,
tough, because both,
yeah,
like, kind of tussling with it. And I didn't realize how hurt I was about being at the intersection of my identities
yeah,
until I was in grad school. And I just spoke recently at my hometown of North New Jersey, and I was referencing to the folks in the room, one of which was my former principal of elementary school. It was a beautiful gathering, and I remember telling them I didn't know that I was um, despised so much in this world because of the intersecting identities where I fall,
yeah,
until I went into grad school and I realized that there were less people that looked like me, less people that shared my experiences, and that my experiences were seen, were demonized, and that I was seen as lesser than, and I felt it was palpable. And that was very traumatic.
yeah,
But before that, I was living, as a Black Dominican, as a woman, right? Not really fully feeling the full extent of my marginalization. So it's tricky for me to answer that without, you know, because there's so much nuance, and some of us are at different points of our identity development. Some of us, are simply, we have other protective factors, which is another part of,
yeah,
generational healing. Important to recognize that some of us have been in homes where there's been so much support and love, and communities where we felt so surrounded, that a lot of these experiences that would have otherwise been traumatic never got a chance to manifest as trauma because we
Yeah.
had the factors in place.
Yeah. So I guess like using your story as an example, and it sounds like realizing this in graduate school was really deeply painful for you. Do you think it was subconsciously affecting you when you were younger and you didn't realize it, or do you think that like the effects of the trauma really hit you in grad school?
Looking back, it was definitely hitting me. I was
You just didn't realize what it was at the time as a kid.
I was in deep trauma. I
Yeah.
just never knew that it was trauma because it was so normalized.
Yeah.
Everyone was in trauma. And I look at some of even my, my friends who are in completely different life paths because their trauma became so embedded in them that life kind of took them in a different direction and their emotions took them in a different direction. And I just happened to be a person who was just so incredibly like enclosed and like withdrawn and shy
Yeah.
that my path looked different. But had I been someone that would have externalized a lot of that pain in ways that some of the people that I know had, I would have been in a completely different path. So I do, but I remember distinctly when I learned what someone does when they're anxious, like biting one's cheeks, like overplaying with one's finger, like things that
Yeah.
I, oh my gosh, I was an anxious kid. I was so traumatized.
Yeah.
And I had no idea until I had the language in now my early 30s about what this actually was. So, nuance, right? Like I would love to have a conversation with this person who asked this question because it's so look at all the thought and the curiosity that's burgeoning from this question, right? Like it would be so amazing if I had this person in
Yeah.
front of me and we could share our understanding of, well, why is it that you don't believe that, you may have fallen?
Yeah. And it looks like the story you just told resonated with someone on here who said that she totally understands that what you're saying as well as a first generational immigrant pursuing college and not seeing others um, like her. Um,
Yeah, but when we were back home and we weren't open to the world and the diversity in the world, right? Because a lot of the people
yeah,
in my neighborhood look like we didn't feel the marginalization to the extent that
yeah,
we would have. But then there were other things like I knew I was poor and that poverty hurt. It
yeah,
hurt. So I knew that there was, trauma in my life. But when it came to my race and when it came to even my Dominican identity, because there was a lot of Black and Latin folks around me, I didn't feel that until I went out into an Ivy League school and I was like, whoa, right? So I think there's a lot of nuance that can be applied to that question.
yeah. Um, Someone else wrote in, and I thought that this question was interesting. I'm curious what you'll make of it. The person said, because in some cultures it's not typical to offer substantial emotional support and is frowned down upon to express difficult emotions, can entire cultures be full of intergenerational trauma? Or is intergenerational trauma defined by what the norm is in the environment in which someone grows up?
That's a beautiful question. And in my book, I actually explain how there are cultural norms that we subscribe to within specific cultures, communities that can also breed intergenerational trauma or further, perpetuate the trauma that exists. And one of the norms is like we don't air our dirty laundry, or what will
Right.
people say, or we don't really kind of talk about things outside of the family, right? And that leaves a lot of secrecy inside of the family. It doesn't allow people to hold responsibility around the hurt that they would have caused. It makes it so that people that are not feeling well, they may be depressed, not actually speak out because they feel like they may actually lose the support or may be doing a disservice to the harmony of their family. There's a lot that happens, as a part of the cultural norms that are embedded within us that also is, implicated in the intergenerational trauma. So I would say absolutely culture, communities, and the norms that are established and sustained have a very big role to play in why we remain unwell within our families and communities.
So how could someone who's in a community like that then break the cycle without being ostracized for being too emotional, too expressive, too, whatever the whatever is looked down upon in that culture?
Well, this may be a little bit of an unpopular way of answering the question, but we we always have to do like a risk evaluation, right? Like
Yeah,
we have to wonder to what extent we would be willing to lose support,
yeah,
lose family, lose loved ones, even if it's in a temporary way, in order to disrupt the status quo. And
yeah,
more often than not, people that go on a cycle breaking journey are ones that are scapegoated, that are ostracized, that are cast aside, and are named the black sheep of the family. Sometimes it doesn't last forever, right? It's just a momentary blip in the relationships that they have, but it will be something that will create a likely loneliness era and some isolation that can be very hurtful. So a person has to weigh their options and they have to determine, do I want to get free, right? And actually like allow myself to feel the freedom of breaking cycles? Or do I want to remain in the comfort? Because there's a good emotion on both sides.
yeah.
There's freedom on one side and then there's comfort on the other side of just keeping things as they are so that I don't have to suffer the consequence of disrupting the status quo. Which one, cost benefit, pros, cons, do whatever it is that you need to do, right? But we all need to be at that crossroads where we have to make a decision. And that decision is going to almost certainly be unpopular.
Yeah, and I think there's so much comfort in the known. Um, and often people find that comfort even in situations that aren't healthy for them, perhaps aren't safe for them. And I think, throughout the book, you do such a wonderful job of both giving people the grace to acknowledge that what's comfortable might not be what's best for them, but also giving them, I don't know if permission is the right word, but kind of like the permission and urge to break away from what's comfortable and to take that risk and to realize that consequences they might face might be worth it, whether that's breaking off unhealthy relationships with family members or going against what a community believes in, that they can both be true, right? It can be comfortable to be where you are right now, and it can be better for you to be uncomfortable and take that step to breaking the cycle.
Mm-hmm. The hope is that it will be a temporary discomfort that would
Yes,
then,
yes.
yeah, into like, it's, I almost failed physics in high school, but there's a lot of laws in nature that help us to understand how energy and like just microscopic energy can completely shift
Yeah,
around it, right? And so I think that if we lean on these laws of physics, the laws that govern like Earth in a very tangible way, we're able to see that there is a lot that we can do in our lives. Like if we apply it to ourselves, within ourselves, there's a lot of work that we can do to allow us to step back into the spaces that we inhabit, the family spaces, the community spaces, work spaces, um, and approach those spaces now with a more rooted, more almost kind of like confident and more nurtured version of ourselves that will actually like help us to actually step into those spaces without them impacting us in the same way. And what tends to happen is that eventually people will have to kind of organize around that new version. So there are different variations of how people decide to go about things, right? Some people are very explicit and they say, no, this is not something I am willing to allow into my life anymore. And they're very, very strict about the boundary. Other people, do the internal work so that they can show back up and they can still go to the family gathering, but within the family gathering, they're no longer willing to entertain or engage in the dysfunction.
Yeah.
And then other people who, choose, something that's somewhere in the middle. And so I love the idea of always tailoring any approach to your life, to your family environment, to your culture, because you know it best as it's applied to your family. I'm Black Dominican, but I know many Black Dominicans that whose families are nothing like mine, who don't approach things the ways that I do, the ways that we do. And so it's going to be really critical for me to scan the environment that I am a part of and the ways that we have applied our cultural norms into our nuclear family and then behave, kind of accordingly. If I want to maintain the relationships, there have been relationships that I've decided to no longer function for me after years of trying, right? Like I didn't just say, oh, you don't want to do things my way. You're no longer in my life, right? Like
Right.
I'm like decades, right? Of like trying. And so we make decisions along the way, and then we reconfigure our community, our network. If our network remains the same, we also reconfigure ourselves in order to feel more well within the networks that we're a part of.
And I think too an important point that you made in the book is that you don't, I'm gonna butcher the wording of what you said, but that you don't have to forgive. And that I think there's often this pressure that people feel to make things right in
Mm-hmm.
relationships, especially as family members get older, as people get sick, and make that point to say that you don't have to forgive, and that sometimes part of your healing journey is deciding that you're going to set that boundary, and other times it's how am I going to be able to preserve parts of this relationship while setting the boundaries that I need to be able to to break the cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like such a an unnecessary burden that we tend to layer on top of when we think of the fact that we have to forgive in order to move on from experiences of trauma. And the reality is that for some of us, those traumatic incidents or the infractions that happens have been so intentional by the other party, have been so unforgivable at times, like really unkind to a very to an extreme. And when that's the case, when you were a child who suffered an entire childhood of feeling victimized by the adults in your life, when you were, continuously overburdened and over parentified by an adult who didn't want to assume their responsibilities of parenting their own children. When these things were long standing and someone was explicitly unwilling to do the work in order to not impose harm upon you, it's okay if you're the way that you are going to get through the process of um, nurturing yourself and the ways that you're going to get into your own healing is by way of not forgetting. That's completely fine. And I wanted to make that very explicit. I added an entire section to that in the book. I wanted to make it very explicit for readers to know this is your healing is not contingent upon your capacity to forgive. It is a choice that you can make and that can help. And what can also help is not forgiving. So you choose, you get to choose. This is for trauma sufferers and trauma survivors, choice and agency is one of the biggest things that's taken away. So I, as a clinician and as an author, did not want to perpetuate that and take away more agency, but instead create paths so that a person can build their agency and build, the actual way in which they would like to lead their own healing.
Yeah. And I have a question that someone wrote in related to that. I just want to note that someone commented here saying this is one of the most important books of our time. It's truly incredible. And I definitely echo this sentiment that it's it's phenomenal. Um, we're talking about forgiveness. Someone wrote in and said, I read that personality disorders are often the result of insecure attachment in childhood. if my father's narcissistic personality disorder affected my upbringing and caused a lot of emotional trauma, could this be seen as intergenerational trauma? Viewing him through this lens makes me feel more compassionate toward him, but I don't want to invalidate my own suffering by being compassionate toward him. And I'm curious what you think about this balance between like trying to have compassion for those who came before us who've also caused us harm, and if there's risk there in um, invalidating the emotions and suffering that we have faced ourselves.
Wow, that question is posed with such care. And, it's just so thoughtful. So I can tell, well, one, that this person is very, very much likely, the child of someone that has narcissistic qualities, because one learns to be that way. It's also a beautiful set of qualities that I don't want to pathologize. And so one of the portions of the book that didn't make it into the book, I took it out. And I took it out because I didn't want people to misinterpret and almost kind of take out of context, was the understanding that hurt people hurt people. And I didn't want people to believe that I was making excuses and also loosening the need for accountability from people that have caused pain. But the reality of the matter is that when we start digging into the shadows of the past of those people that have wounded us, almost always we're going to find places where they've been wounded pretty deeply. And I am not a narcissistic personality disorder expert, but I do have friends who are, and I trained in the area. Did not like it. I more so leaned in the direction of really wanting to help survivors. But I do recall a lot of those seminars and sitting through case conceptualizations of my colleagues who were looking for advice among a group of us around how to orient around a client who had narcissistic traits. And I remember what was most striking to me, and again, because we had so many of these, we were at a hospital system, so we had a lot of people who presented with these qualities. And time and again, these people had really hard childhoods,
Yeah.
really adverse experiences, a ton of abuse, a ton of lack of care, a lot of neglect, parental separation that was violent. And there were so many intensely aggressive, adverse experiences in the lives of these individuals that then developed a really maladaptive way of organizing around relationships, which was narcissistic qualities or toxic qualities. So it is important for us to also hold on to that lens, because I think it's a disservice for us to just point the finger at the narcissist and say, you're messed up and you can continue to. People don't just hurt people just out of thin air, unless they have some structural things happening in their brain and maybe psychopathy. But an individual who is presenting with narcissistic traits must be understood also, and I believe that they must be understood because we also need to help rehabilitate or habilitate the individuals that present with these kinds of conditions so that they can stop hurting other people. But it is important for us to understand that almost always when we're working with narcissistic personality disorder, some of what we're helping a person through is a deep sense of despair, an inability to really hone in on who they truly are, low self-esteem, and a childhood, more often than not, that was deeply traumatic. So I like to hold the balance while not also negating the experiences of survivors, which is why I didn't add it to the book, so as to not cause confusion. But it is really important for us to understand that very often these individuals that cause pain, that hold these traits, very likely came from homes that had some hurt within them.
And I guess I'm trying to think. I'm mindful of time of other questions that were common, and I think two that came up pretty frequently were if I guess one was essentially if it's appropriate to point out someone else's intergenerational trauma. So, for example, if someone's significant other, like if someone reads this book and recognizes intergenerational trauma in their partner and wants to, suggest that or raise that so that their partner can do work, is that A, appropriate, and B, what's the right way to do that? And then a somewhat related question, you can choose one or both, is if there are ways to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma for a partner to protect one's own child. So the person who wrote in said that her husband is a wonderful father, but has a lot of intergenerational trauma, and she worries that their children will inadvertently inherit that. And so how she can, I think it was she can intervene in a way that's, not invasive while still creating a healthy family.
Hmm. Well, uh, it is going to be incredibly important for any one of us who are hoping to see other people in our lives heal, for us to help them to know that there is a concept called intergenerational trauma out there, and that there is a book that is an interesting read, or that there's a link, to a chat that some folks had that was really interesting about a book, right? Like all the things that can almost kind of bring in the concept of generational healing, almost kind of like through the side door, rather than by saying, that's intergenerational trauma, you need to get help, which
Yeah.
is more tends to happen, which builds up walls, which people then feel targeted, they feel shamed, and that is, shame is not mobilizing. It's not going to push people into action. So it's going to be really important to almost kind of like use that side door mechanism, like send information their way. Maybe there's a podcast that you found interesting on the topic, right? And so just send a link, or just share it with them, or listen to it in the home, and just allow them to really absorb some of those details. Um, and there is a beauty in also healing, co-healing together when it comes to intergenerational trauma, and creating that experience of healing with one another, so as to create a stronger bond, and also help each other understand each other from a deeper perspective, and also create a cohesive goal of making sure that the next generation, your children, are being impacted in the best way possible, that is reflective of the legacy that you're hoping to build. A lot of this language isn't really even in day-to-day language for people that are in relationships, in parenting. And if we start infusing it, people actually have choice, right? They have the language, and they can choose to lean on the language, or they can choose to do away with the language and lean into the patterns that have been long-standing. So choice and agency is always something that can be burgeoned, either through the healing that one does oneself, or it can be burgeoned through the expansion of the tools that one has at one's disposal, which is made available when a person gives you a book or sends you a link or whatever.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that I will be recommending your book to many, many, many people, and I think you do a wonderful job of validating from the get-go all types of trauma, and talking about the breadth of ways that intergenerational trauma can come up. And I know that whether it be in my personal life or in clinical work, people often feel like they have to preface talking about a traumatic experience by saying, I know that this isn't real trauma, or I know that other people have more trauma. And I think there's this pressure to compare, and I think some of that is probably trying to emotionally process and tell themselves that it's okay. But I think that there is a lot of comparison when it comes to trauma, and like any, you talk about the big T traumas and the little T traumas, and any trauma is trauma. And I think that you do such a wonderful job of, through the stories of your clients, through your own stories, representing all types of people and all types of traumatic experiences in a way that I feel like virtually anyone, certainly anyone I know, could read this book and not only learn from it, enjoy it, but also be able to reflect on themselves and their own experiences in really a beautiful way. Um, you spoke about podcasts, and I know that you have a wonderful podcast. I just want to give you the opportunity to share either anything that's coming up for you or where people who have read the book and love the book can continue to consume and benefit from your wisdom.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So, people can find me on my website, which within my website, I have a newsletter that I send out that has a break the cycle coping tip that is reflected in each of the newsletters, which is another way to just kind of continue the work or to, share some of those tips with some people that you love. And I do have some things on the horizon, a course that's coming out on trauma at some point soon in the next couple of days, I believe. And in addition to that, eventually I will be, reopening up services, which I sunsetted in the process of this book. But there's a lot of those things that are driving me back into the work, which I'm super excited about because the book world is like this whirlwind of like, whoa, overtakes you. And to get back into, having my hands in the work is really what I came into this work to do. So I'm really excited that I get to dive back in. So those are the things that are coming up. So people can stay tuned on my website, but on my LinkedIn mostly is probably where I'll be announcing things, so people can find me there.
Terrific. And one question I like to ask all of the authors is there anything you have read recently that really excited you, or what are you reading right now, if anything?
Yes. For the past decade, I've been very interested in the understandings of caste. I just finished Bill Wilson's book, Caste, but it opened me up to this other book called The Trauma of Caste, situated explicitly, I believe, in India, but it is a very fascinating book about the implications of caste systems, particularly there. And I'm really curious about expanding my understanding of the different ways in which trauma has been exacerbated within communities on a global scale. I want my work to not be only US centered just because I live. I want to be able to have a great understanding of the world that's out there. So I'm really excited about that book.
And what was it? It was called The Trauma of Caste?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you
I actually have it.
so much for
It's this.
terrific. Thank you for being our March book club author. It's been a real pleasure reading your book. Again, it's Break the Cycle, and speaking to you today. And you know, I've said it so many times in this discussion, but I feel like you are a wealth of knowledge and explain things in such a kind, compassionate, clear way. And the work you're doing is so incredibly important and really a gift to all of us. And I see someone just wrote in is Breaking the Cycle in Spanish, and I believe it is in Spanish as well. Is that correct?
In about 6 weeks.
Oh, okay. Very exciting.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. This was just really wonderful, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I hope you do too.
Okay, goodbye.